Hi everyone, I'm making this video to talk more about growth in tech careers. Salaries in tech, especially in India, are very diverse. Just on entry level alone, you have companies that pay like 2 lakhs per annum, and at the same time, you have companies that pay like 40 lakhs, even in a bad market. So, a gap of 20x. And this gap only becomes wider and wider with more experience, especially if you're not growing in your role. And what's the then way to move up in this ladder and bridge this gap? The only way to do that is by building the right skills and capabilities. Hi, I'm Anshuman Singh, and I'm making this video to deep dive into what it takes for you to grow in your career. I also then want to take you through the scalar curriculum to talk more about how the curriculum actually bridges the gap that I'm talking about. I believe the scalar curriculum is one of the most comprehensive curriculum for your path, but then I'll also show you that. You are a junior front end or full stack developer. Even if you're a full stack developer, you have more front end inclination than back end inclination. If that is not the case, then you'll find links in the description below, depending on who you are, what you identify as. And please go and then open that link and then watch that video. If you're staying back, I'm going to assume that you are either a junior front end developer or a full stack developer who is more front end inclined. But before I show you the path, I want to talk about why people fail to get there. What is expected of people at your level and why do they fail? And there I want to talk about two things. One is why do they fail in interviews when they go to companies? And second thing I want to talk about is how do they fail in work? If at all they're able to get to, let's say, the right kind of companies, what inhibits their growth? Let's start with the interviews first. Now, before I get into the interview rounds, I'll tell you like broadly what I keep hearing from junior front end or full stack developers on why they fail. Firstly, for some reason, I don't know why, but a lot of front end and full stack developer believe that DSA is not important for them. Look, there are some companies that do not index on DSA. I agree with that. But if you're looking at all high paying companies, all product companies, chances are they will index on DSA. Your DSA is going to be probably easier than others, but they will index on DSA. There is also, by the way, a faction that argues why is DSA important. Now, look, I mean, if you look at things around you, things that you probably also use in your library, it is possible it's under the hood. If somebody ever asks you to implement that, you'll have to use DSA. You need to know DSA, right? For example, you use caching. I mean, I'm very sure, like, for example, in JavaScript, you can't live without hash maps. So, hash map, if somebody asks you to implement a hash map, that is DSA. If somebody asks you to implement a cache or let's say an LRU cache, that's DSA. Um, if you use, like Linux, in Linux you have diff function. If somebody asks you to implement the diff function in files, which shows you the difference between files, that's DSA. Um, in fact, in front end, you see these spell checkers. Spell checkers also DSA. You have these autocomplete. I mean, as you type, it shows you suggestions. That is also DSA. So in a way, you're anyhow going to be using DSA on a day-to-day basis, and hence a lot of companies index on that. So that's one part like where majority people fail. They tend to ignore DSA. Second thing is, second place where people fail is in the understanding of the web architecture. So a lot of people are good HTML, CSS developers. Maybe basic JavaScript they understand as well. However, when it comes to the core of JavaScript, that's where they start to struggle. For example, if I ask them, hey, look, maybe explain the execution process, including the call stack, event loop, callback queue, the single threaded nature of the JavaScript execution engine, and the role of the runtime environment in JavaScript, then they would struggle with that. If I ask them, hey, look, I mean, describe to me what happens when you type google.com and press enter, step by step, everything. What's the DNS? Then, like, how do you form your request? How do you get your response? Um, they struggle with that. Sometimes like even the basic difference between, let's say, what is a polling versus what is a socket, web socket, what's a normal HTTP request, people tend to struggle with that. Even work wise, right? Like for example, if there is a question of what is, let's say, if you have to optimize the site performance, what are things that you would look at? What is a CDN? Or maybe things like, for example, if I have to design techniques to minimize the JavaScript bundle size, then how can I do that? People struggle with that. um, Things around like what is lazy loading, how do I do code splitting, or if I have to, let's say, do resource optimizations, um, whether, let's say, the server that I'm talking to that supports certain kind of encryption or compressions, people might struggle with that. And if you've just learned only, like how to build a basic front end, you've done very basic projects, it is natural to struggle with that. But because people fail here, hence I'm going to talk about, look, what kind of rounds happen in interviews, and then what should you learn so that you become comfortable with these things. So that's part one, where people fail. Part two, at work, to be honest, full stack development, front end development is a lot about one, being able to learn new things quickly. So I mean, your frameworks, your libraries keep changing. Sometimes Angular is more popular than React is more popular, then Vue.js is more popular. Tomorrow something, Next.js is more popular. Tomorrow something else will be more popular. Uh, Frameworks will keep changing, libraries will keep changing, and you can't expect to be taught everything. So you have to be able to understand the fundamentals really well, which is JavaScript, and then be able to learn these new frameworks, libraries, etc. very quickly. A lot of people struggle to do that, and hence they start to struggle at work as well. With front end and full stack developer, one of the other expectations is that you're going to be working very closely with the product team. So in a way, you have to be able to contribute to product discussions. You have to be able to deal with ambiguous problem statements around, let's say, user engagement. What do I do so that user engagement increases? How do I increase the DAOs, mouse on the website? What kind of metrics measurement should I have in place? All of those, again, sometimes people start to struggle with. So you have to get better on those aspects if you have to grow within work. Now, if that's the case, then I will actually spend some time to discuss the curriculum that will enable that. And in fact, that is going to be the scalar curriculum, and I'll draw parallels on how it enables you on all of these aspects. But before I do that, let me also, maybe I talked about why people fail. Let me talk about the exact interview that you might expect if you are going for a junior front end or full stack role at a good product company. You should expect that you'll have 2 to 3 rounds of DSA. In some companies, that might just be one round. You should not expect hard questions there. There will be easy to medium question. However, in easy to medium question as well, topic coverage is everything. You can get questions even on dynamic programming, for example. Apart from that, there are certain tech rounds. This is where in-depth questions around JavaScript, CSS, um, that will be asked. In some companies, maybe the first round itself is a machine coding round, or a assignment where you have to build something. So maybe there are follow-up questions on those. If you use a library or a framework like React or Angular, then there might be questions on those. um, and given, if you're a full stack developer, then the backend technology, like you could be a Java developer on the backend, or you could be a Node.js developer, again maybe you'll have questions, deeper questions on those. The third kind of round that you might have to go through, now that depends on your seniority. If you've just started in front end and full stack engineering, probably less important, but like as you become more and more senior, it becomes more and more important. The third kind of round is design rounds. Firstly, a lot of emphasis on the kind of work you have done in the past or projects you have built in the past, digging deeper into that, asking why you did things a certain way. If, let's say, things were to change, maybe a scenario changes, then what do you do? For example, let's say you build a blogging website. Now I want to add the feature of enabling multiple people editing the blog at the same time. Then how will you implement that? That becomes a question. Your ability of designing API and schema design. For example, one of the popular questions is, how would you design the API for Google Calendar? Reason being that front end and full stack developers, they are at the mix of front end and back end, and hence API is the one connecting. You have to be able to design reasonable APIs, which is comfortable for front end developers. And I mean, front end developers need to have a good say in that. Questions around web architecture, which is, how does a browser work? How do you optimize the performance? What is a DOM? How is DOM rendered? What is repaint, for example? For example, if I tell you, hey, look, how do you implement a Google Sheet like thing, which doesn't keep hanging but like actually works very smoothly, then how would you go about doing that? um, in most cases at junior levels, you might not be asked architectural design questions, but in some cases very basic question. For example, how would you design, let's say, a URL shortener? Would you use a SQL DB or a no SQL DB? Why so? Questions like those might come, but very less likely. And one of the common rounds in, let's say, wherever you would expect hard interview rounds, you would see a scenario based design round. For example, if you're, let's say, designing a Google Doc, now on Google Doc, what will be your APIs? If there are multiple people editing the Google Doc, how will you handle that? What kind of visual treatment would you give if people are editing it exactly at the same place? How do you do conflict resolution? All of that. How do you maintain states? You'll be asked about that. Or if, let's say, you're in, I mean, you might have seen, like, if you do an image search on Google, as you scroll, there is no pages, as you it's infinite scroll. Like, how do you implement infinite scroll? How do you make sure that you don't have to fetch all the data? um, which is around lazy loading. Like, do you understand that, right? So those are your questions in interviews. Now, if those are the questions in the interviews, if those are the questions in work, then you might also have a question: how should I go step by step learning this? And for that, I will take you through the curriculum of Scalar. Scalar curriculum has multiple tracks, including backend track, full stack track, and data engineering track. However, given your background, I would recommend sticking to the full stack track. And there I will talk about the modules, what or how they help with the interviews, how they help with the jobs, and in a way, if you complete the module, then what are you able to do after this module? The first module, no surprise, is DSA. Now, if imagine I'm making the assumption that all of you already know how to code, even though it is in JavaScript, you know how to code. In case you don't, then, like, for beginners, there is a 2 month module before this which teaches them how to code in basic Java. But I mean, if you unless you don't know how to code, you don't shouldn't start with beginners. You should start from here, right? So DSA. Now DSA is very exhaustive, has all the topics. Has I mean, the way it is delivered is that you have live lectures, and post that every day you get assignments. um, and assignments are basically helping you practice and build that habit of coding. One good outcome of that is, if you code regularly, in a way, over a period of time, your coding accuracy increases. In a way, you make less and less bugs, which directly correlates to productivity, because if you make less bugs, you get more code done faster, you build more features faster. So it actually correlates to work productivity. Not to mean, I mean, like, when it comes to interview, obviously, like, this is very very important for the interview. Typically you'll have 1 to 3 rounds on DSA and problem solving. All topics are covered here. If you've covered this is going to be fairly exhaustive. On jobs, as I said, coding accuracy. In a way, once you do this, then, like, thinking about things efficiently, that becomes almost a given. um, and it becomes easier for you to understand how other systems work, because a lot of those systems, they use DSA internally. In a way, if you have done this DSA, then some of the problems I mentioned, right, which is, let's say, how would you design your own autocomplete? How would you design your own spell checker if there were no libraries? um, or how do you go about, let's say, sorting in a particular fashion, etc.? All of those become extremely easy functions for you. um, so post DSA, which is 4 to 5 months, then you come to relational databases. Now this is again, like, for a full stack developer, you might say, I might also need to know NoSQL databases. Sure, it is later on covered in the HLD module, but let me just talk about the relational databases right now. Here, what is covered is everything around schema design, indexing, transactions, isolation levels, and then how to write SQL queries. Um, Now, in interviews, as a full stack developer or as a front end developer, you're going to be given questions around schema design, right? So this basically covers that. You might be asked to write SQL queries, again covered. You might get asked basic questions on transactions and indexing, also covered here. um, in a way, if you build any full stack project, you would you would be required to use some database, and actually, Relational DB is at the backbone of it. So at work, it will help you in all your full stack projects, especially like for the backend portions that you contribute to. Um, Once you're done with the relational DB, then the next step is where you start with the full stack track. Now, there the first part is where you learn in depth about HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So, if you remember, like some of the deep JavaScript questions that I mentioned about, or deep CSS questions that I mentioned about in my earlier part, all of those are covered here as well. And they're covered in some structure. And I mean, they're just not covered in theory, but like you get to also implement through assignments. And assignments, you might be asked to implement a JavaScript feature, or here is a front end, maybe change the interaction somehow, or maybe draw a shape using CSS. All of those is given as part of assignments, which is then automatically evaluated through our judge. Um, so that's your HTML, CSS, JavaScript in depth part, which covers for interview your JavaScript questions, CSS questions, tech round questions, and web architecture, a small part of web architecture questions. In jobs, to be honest, I mean, if JavaScript is the basis of everything, so if you don't understand JavaScript in depth, you're going to struggle at job. So hence, very, very critical for module for jobs as well. The next module, but before I move to the next module, it is possible some of you might already know these things in depth, or maybe you know 90% of this stuff. One of the other things I want to call out is that if in all of these modules, if you feel that you already know 80-90% stuff, post May of 15th of 2024, if you reach a module within Scalar, then you can skip that module and in return get the notes and the assignments for that module. You can move on with the next module. If later on you realize that you want to redo this module, you can redo it as well. So the modularizations will be supported at Scalar, and hence you'll be able to attempt these modules in by skipping it, as long as you are fulfilling the prerequisites for the next modules. So hence, if you already know 90% of this, you can skip this module, and you'll get notes in return. You can solve the assignments asynchronously, and you can take the mock interviews or contest asynchronously as well. All right, moving on. So the module after that is again the full stack part 2, where you learn more about React, DOM, and machine coding with low level design. This is this is where, I mean, you actually start building some small projects, which is your machine coding rounds. But in a way, like some of the things that I mentioned, like for example, type ahead, or network optimizations. How does internet work? How does React work? And then maybe starting to build now things on React. All of that is covered in this module. So in your interviews, all questions that are around React, all questions which involve a machine coding round or some form of assignment, um, all questions around web architecture, I mean, actually, portion of web architecture, website optimizations, design case studies, they get covered in this module. Again, very important for work as well. In a way, if you have done this module, then you'll have good hold on React.js. You would have good hold on understanding how does the entire request flow across, and hence what are the steps involved to optimize websites. How does a browser work and the browser architecture? How does web work and web architecture? Those things you'll get better on, and you'll get better on making machine coding rounds as well. One other thing to keep in mind is that even in this module, you have assignments, however, are of different kind. You might have assignments where you might have to add a feature or build small things, and then maybe through unit test cases we check whether you build the feature correctly or not. Or there are these other kind of assignments where you might have to build a component, and then we check whether the component is working as expected or not. And there might be some MCQs as well. In fact, like you can assume that almost in every module, every class has some or the other form of assignments. Okay, then moving on, post that, there is a full stack capstone project module. This is where you build your project. First, you learn about a backend. Now, one of the things we do is here we've chosen the Node.js and MongoDB as the backend, which is the MERN stack. However, you could also choose to have Java as the backend. in case, let's say, you want to become a Java full stack developer. So that's another option where you can maybe, since you might have done maybe earlier modules in Java. So if you have done earlier modules in Java, maybe you could choose Java as the backend. Given you already know JavaScript, so hence we've kept it comfortable, Node.js and then one stack. And this is where you again like start to build a project and like learn a bunch of things in the process. So you learn about Node.js, MongoDB, MVC architecture, certain design patterns as well. So factory design pattern, for example. How do you validate data? How do you authenticate? How do you design APIs? All of that, along with WebSockets, testing and security, all of that is covered in the full stack capstone project. Here, the capstone project is, let's say, building something like a book my show end to end, or something like an IMDb end to end. That is an example project, but you build it over a period of 1.5 months. Now, why is this important? Firstly, it helps with your resume because there is a project built there. You shouldn't stop here. You should also go and build more things once you have done this. But it gives you a start. It gives you one decent project on your resume. Two is it helps with all API design questions, schema design questions, while schema design has already happened in SQL module as well, and whatever was remaining in the web architecture. So things around authentication, security, testing, all of those are also covered in this module. You also, by the way, learn to integrate external APIs and payment gateway, for example, through this module. Now, everything done in this module is probably the closest to work. So, hence, doing this module helps immensely with work as well. Once you have done that, then there is system design module. System design is where you now start to also learn how things scale in the backend and in the web architecture. So when you're building something very large scale, then how does that work? First, the building blocks: caching, CDNs, master slave, multi master, SQL, NoSQL, etc., etc. And then a bunch of case studies like search type ahead, messages, Elasticsearch, let's say something like a Zomato or a Swiggy or a Google Map, Uber, Hotstar. Those we cover in the form of case studies. So if you have a system design round, this is more than comprehensive. Most probably you will not even get these kind of questions. You might be expected to know lesser system design, but like there is no harm in knowing more of system design. This, by the way, also is helpful because at work, if you are good at this, then it becomes easier to have conversations with people who are senior in the back end. Um, in a way, it helps you spread across the entire full stack realm, have design discussions, becomes easier for you to move up the ladder as well. If you have done this now, then there are a couple of electives. One is around product management for engineers, which is what I would recommend that you should do given your background. There is one more which is around data engineering. Now this is, to be honest, very optional, might not be needed for you for the kind of work you would do. But product management for engineers, which is a 1 month elective, which is something I would recommend because it will help you understand product metrics really well. It will help you understand how to set up measurements really well. It will help you also think through that if you're given an ambiguous goal of, let's say, a user metric, then how do you break it down and then how do you go towards that goal. Eventually helps you succeed in the role that you are in. I repeat once more, all of these modules have assignments, a bunch of which is actually self evaluated and are coding assignments. I mean, they're not necessarily MCQs. Some are MCQs. So by the time you're done with all of this, you'd also be fairly hands on, assuming you're attending the classes and solving the assignments as well. One more thing which I would add is, look, I mean, having the curriculum is one thing, but curriculum alone doesn't make sure that you actually end up learning. Content alone doesn't have a lot of value. It's basically the ecosystem that you learn in. One of the parameters that we have seen is that the completion rates at scalar, if compared to, let's say, recorded courses, are roughly like 100 times better. And one of the reasons for that is that you're not learning alone. You basically have other peers with you who are very similar, so you basically are talking about assignments almost every day in a group. You have live classes, so there is a schedule that is enforced. um, After every class there is assignment, so in a way there is a habit that gets built over a period of time, that you attend classes, then you solve assignments, then you attend classes, then you solve assignments, and so forth. You have TAs that help you in case you get stuck solving a problem. You have one-on-one mentors that actually guide you in this journey, so you can talk to them, you can schedule calls with them. In fact, I would recommend that as you become more and more senior, paths basically diverge. So actually getting insights from your mentor, who might be actually more senior than you in your career, is is going to be extremely useful, and hence you should keep talking to your mentor as frequently as possible. um, and I mean, eventually the community, you develop friends, you develop peers who help you stay more consistent. Thankfully the platform also is very gamified, so if you like what you're learning, actually there are good chances that the platform will also become addictive, and hopefully you will develop a very large streak of problem solving, and then you get to post about that on LinkedIn. Anyway, so that's more or less about Scalar. I hope that helps in understanding what to learn, how to learn, and if you decide to join Scalar, then I'll see you there. Thank you.